and welcome to Connecting the Dots with me, Sam Garner, and my esteemed colleague,
Dr. Luke Roberts. Hello,
Dr.
everyone.
Luke Roberts. Thank you. We talk to brilliant minds from education, manufacturing, public service, and beyond, exploring the dynamic interplay between people and the systems that drive their success, and maybe discover how you can connect more dots in your own life and work. So, as always, we start with Luke. What has excited you this week?
Good question, Sam. So this week, my mum asked me what is a co-pilot, and I had to explain to her that it's a form of AI. And
Yeah.
then she wanted a demonstration of it because she used to be a teacher. So she said, create me a lesson plan in English and French. So we did that. And then I had to kind of teach her how to be critical of
Yeah.
what the AI produces, not just accept the first thing. So she ended up kind of being like starting skeptical, seeing its purpose, but not buying into it wholeheartedly. So I think that's going back to, was it Daniel Kahneman's System One is intuitive and fast. System two is slow and analytical. So I was trying to tap into a system two when using Copilot. So we'll see how
Oh,
she does in the future with it.
okay.
But
I like
yeah,
that.
exciting. And
Do we
what's
need?
excited
Well,
you?
I'm just going to say, we used to call old people silver surfers when they used to go. Do we need like a term for old people going on AI or something? I'm sure we can think of
Well, if
something.
you put A and I, then definitely
Yeah, that's not good,
sounds.
is it? That sound old there. But moving forward, what excited me was I was reading our next guest. Drum roll, let's have the suspension. Not suspension. Suspense, build the suspense here. I was reading his book on the wounded elite and came across the title entitled Illusion Speak, which is where people speak without conscious shame or doubt. And it doesn't have to be true, but as far as they're concerned, it's true for that moment. And they're able to completely say something different later on without embarrassment. And I just thought, love that. That explains an awful lot to me. So I'm really excited to discuss that further. So our guest this week is the wonderful Nick Duffell. And Nick's background, he was born in 1949. He boarded in Europe and the UK. He got a degree in Sanskrit from Oxford. He taught in a boarding school in India. He retrained as a psychotherapist, worked as a family therapist and organizational consultant. And got a massive range of experience, has written lots of books that we're going to put links to, and I strongly recommend people read them. He's got two grown-up sons. And some of the books he's written with wide critical acclaim was Wounded Leaders, Trauma, Abandonment, and Privilege, and the Unmaking of Them. He's now co founded the Centre for General Psychology, which hopefully he's going to tell us about later on. And what was a surprise thing about Nick is that he also spent time after his job in India. He worked as a carpenter and he's still using the oak trees that he felled when he owned a forest. So I think that would be do you do any woodwork now, Nick? Well, first of all, welcome, Nick.
Hi, Nick.
Thank you. What a lovely introduction. Well, if you zoom in on the background, you see I'm sitting surrounded by my tools here in my office because I'm building a little extension on our cottage here.
Just building a little extension. You say that as if you're washing
Oh,
up or
just two
something.
walls. Yeah, two
Yeah,
walls.
well done. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. I have been super excited about this. So basically, you were an early builder yourself and you experienced trauma as a result of that. And that led you into, well, what you tell us how it sort of your experiences led you into where
Okay.
you are today.
Okay. Well, I sometimes wonder why did I end up getting into this work? Because if I think of my early boarding, I went to a very benign school full of American Army personnel in east of Switzerland in the 1950s when my father was had a job working for Hoover Limited in in Germany. And rather I had 4 terms in the army school there, and I was a bit of an adapter, and I would come back with a new accent every term. And my dad's story was when I came back with a Geordie accent, Now, given my dad was trying to lose his Cockney accent as fast as he could because it was those aspirational days after the war, he said, enough is enough. We're going to have to send you away. So it was either sending me to England or sending me to somewhere in Europe. And luckily, I got sent to this American school, which was very benign, where we just hung about. Of course, I missed my parents in the beginning. But then I had to go back to England to the English school, and I could not believe the way that school was run and the attitude, because I was all the time told that I was a stupid boy, but at the same time, I was going to be leading the country. And I couldn't put this together in my head, what this was about. So I was a sort of mild rebel in this. And I don't think I was particularly traumatized, actually.
Okay.
But it did, being institutionalized for so many years, did affect my behavior. So, particularly in relationships, because I didn't know how to relate to women, and I thought they were going to sort of make everything good for me when I got out of school. And so, in the beginning, I was a pretty bad husband, as many ex-boarders are, because you're used to living like on your own in a crowd. You're not used to living in a partnership. You're not used to sharing. And because you have to put away your sort of feelings about being sent away from home, you don't come out of boarding school with emotional literacy.
Mm.
So I experienced all those things in myself. And I went into therapy as a client, and I had a breakdown at a certain point. I was working as a carpenter, had a breakdown, had no idea that boarding school might have anything to do with it, as nobody did in those days. And my therapist didn't talk about it, didn't, I went to, expensive private schools. So the therapist was, a little bit overawed by this sort of thing. And it wasn't until I went into, I became a client. And then actually my therapist put me on a training course, and I fell in love with a woman on the training course. And that's why I went into training. I
Okay.
didn't want to be a therapist. I just wanted to meet this woman. And I did eventually married her. And so, and then I carried on with the training, and it suddenly clicked with me. After about three years of training, I suddenly started to understand a few things. And I was working in a men's group in the time. That was a time when the men's movement was big, and I was an assistant in this. And then I realized there were some guys on these groups that needed something different. They had this kind of wounded quality about them.
Mm.
They were very nice, but they just, they couldn't say what they wanted, couldn't talk about their feelings. They needed something different. And I realized they all had in common they'd been to boarding school. And then, oh my God, this is me too. So I started to make a study of this, and it became my qualifying thesis. And in 1989, I started to think very seriously about how to apply this. And I started my first workshop for boarding school survivors, as I called them, in
Mm.
a provocative way at the time.
Mm.
And then I had the most incredible bit of luck come my way, because there was a woman whose house I had worked on. I'd actually worked on her roof. And she was moving house. This was in London. And she invited me to a housewarming party. And I had this leaflet, Boarding School Survivors, I just made. And I gave her a copy. I said, I think this might amuse you, because I know she was quite critical of the establishment. And she said, oh my God, I've been looking for someone to write a piece in the independent paper about the downsides of boarding, and I can't find anybody to say anything intelligent about it. Would you like the job? Wow, would I? So I got the job to write a piece in the Independent, and it came out in September 1990. And you know what? They had this huge mailbag, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters for people. This is before email.
Mm.
They all ended up on my forwarded to me on my little tiny flat front door. And people were saying, thank God, I thought I was the only one. Thank God for speaking out about this. And other people were saying, can you fix my husband? He's one of those. Yeah. And a few people were saying, scum like you should be, exported to the outer,
Oh, nice. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
this sort of thing at
Yeah.
the same time, because it wasn't very patriotic. And it all kicked off from there. And then I had a lot of media interest. I was suddenly converted into an expert about something I was only just beginning to discover. So it was
Mm.
very odd. And then the BBC made a film about following some children for their first days in prep school called The Making of Them, which went out in January 94. Still a stunning film. I still use it in training sessions. And eventually, my first book, I took the same name of this film. And my first book, The Making of Them, came out in 2000.
Hmm.
And I was quite tentative about my whole thesis because there was quite a lot of kickback, even from the therapy profession, because therapists didn't get it. And it's a middle class profession, and it's dominated by middle class women. A lot of them had their kids in boarding school. They didn't want to feel guilty.
Mm.
So yeah, from 2000, it really started in a big way. And then luckily, in the mid noughties, Joy Chavarin, this art therapist and Jungian professor, contacted me, and she said, "I've just been doing some case studies about exporters, and I looked into it a bit, and I realized that all the founding fathers of British psychotherapy were exporters, and none of them talked about it in their analysis."
That's
So
interesting.
that was great. She got this piece. And so I finally had a colleague and we worked together. And she sadly died this year, having come up with the name boarding school syndrome, which is now applies to it. And then we started really to pick away at the therapy profession to try to get them to understand there was something going on here they should uh, give attention to.
Mm.
And then the zeitgeist shifted a bit because you suddenly had Bowlby's attachment theory come back into fashion because when I started training, it was thought of as common sense. You had trauma studies arriving, and you had all that neuroscience data
Yeah.
about what the traumatized brain looks like. So suddenly people started to get interested in this work. So now I do a CPD day, and I always have a waiting list. So
So what I'm going to come on in a minute to the reaction of it, but I want to if you could give us a summary of I know I think I read in one of your books the trauma abandonment privilege. You said it's one of the most overlooked forms of child abuse
yeah.
still happening today. Can you talk to us briefly about the why it is such a traumatic and devastating impact, and what is the potential outcome of that?
Well, this is where it sort of aligns with what you told me earlier about the systems,
Mm.
because there we have a sort of phenomenon in Britain where there's a sort of character who is a national character ideal, who is gentlemanly, who speaks in a posh voice, and is perhaps not, sometimes rather diffident or something like that.
Mm.
These are the people who we think should be governing us, and they have been governing us for the last, 200 years. And um, what these people have in common is that almost everybody in the upper classes and in the political classes went to boarding schools and were trained to be leaders. And what I set out to do in my second book, Wounded Leaders, was to say that if you institutionalize children and if you uh, prevent them from having emotional intelligence and take away their ability to express or even feel their feelings,
Mm.
they're not going to make very good judgments. And this we know from the neuroscience. We know that people who've got the part of the brain which deals with emotions, who've got the link broken or impaired or something, can function perfectly well, but they can't make good decisions. And I also said that if you have children who are taught from the age of 7 or 8 that it's not okay to be vulnerable and that you mustn't show you're missing your mummy and daddy
Mm.
and you have to get on your own like a big boy at 8, then how can you expect that these people, if they're in charge of the country, are going to have to deal with the vulnerable in society?
Mm.
Because they actually, the whole process about vulnerability has gone out the window.
Mm.
And it's just not going to happen. They can't do it. And if you look back, if you look back in the history of the Tory party, for example, there are several economists who say very clearly one thing that stands out, it's the history of bad decisions.
Yeah.
And I put this down to what Joy called boarding school syndrome, from having to disown their emotions as children, for having to learn to talk the talk, play the game, be competitive, but actually not have any idea about how to be empathic, how to live in intimate couples or in family situations because they've been in an institution
Mm.
and they're not they may talk the talk and speak, come out with a bit of Latin like Boris Johnson did at a moment of stress, but actually they're not the kind of people we want to elect. And they've
Uh,
affected us all because we all expect it. Even the working classes expect it.
yeah.
Yeah. And so it means that we haven't really formed a proper social democracy like our European neighbors.
And it's interesting you said the word about playing the game there, there is this concept without emotional literacy. It is a game to be won, and it's like that they're very good debaters.
Oh
They're
yeah.
very good at, and that's everything is just a debate that we have to win. The emotional consequences don't matter.
Yeah. I mean, the brilliant American journalist Michael Goldfarb did a fantastic program some years ago on the British establishment. And he says basically you go to Oxford and Cambridge and you learn to talk the talk. And
Mm.
that's what's needed. That's what gets you ahead. And you learn to meet people and network and talk the talk, but actually it doesn't fit you for leadership.
And it's also for these children as well that have experienced this emotional distress. They're told they're lucky to be there. And
Well,
that's the sort of contradiction. It doesn't feel very lucky to me.
there's a paradox here, isn't there?
Mm.
Because there is no doubt it is a social privilege to go anyway to a private school and this why the subject is so complicated. It's not just the psychology, we've got the whole educational and social aspects of this. So I mean there are these questions. Is private education a thing you want? Is educating an elite a thing you want? It certainly was wanted in the mid 19th century when these schools were sort of invented.
Mm.
um, we wanted an elite to govern the British Empire, and we needed lots of these people, and
Mm.
that's where these what these schools were used for, and they do churn out a kind of recognizable kind of standard product from the school. But uh, people who've been to those schools, they function very well within other institutions, like the civil service, like the House of Commons, like the the clergy,
And the
like
media, there's a high proportion of
oh, the
media.
BBC. Yeah, I mean
Mm.
that. I have to tell you that the newspaper that I've had most difficulty accepting my stuff has been the Guardian.
Really?
Yeah, because the
Okay.
Guardian's run by lots and lots of switched on public school people.
Mm. Mm.
Certainly was. Um, and of course, there's a tremendous pushback from the other media. And the other thing, of course, with the whole thing about the boarding school system is that it's a massive financial lobby.
Mm.
It's worth a few £1 billion. The Boarding Schools Association want always to say that the problems associated with boarding school were always in the past and it's not Tom Brown now, or it's not like when I was at school, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
But okay. I mean, the thing is, boarding schools, they're market driven. So when I was first sent to boarding school, uh, we weren't interested in carpets and radiators. Our homes were pretty ghastly and cold anyway. Bathroom was a nightmare. But that wouldn't wash today. So they've
No.
got all that, you know, they're much more up to date in that respect, but they still haven't got parents. They still haven't got siblings. They still haven't got the family pets. You
No.
still haven't got home. You're still bringing your child up in a sort of care, and back to your original question, care, which is very well provided for.
Mm.
They've got, you know, the privilege is fantastic playing fields, small classes, 5.5 days a week in school, you know.
Mm.
This is a social privilege. There's no doubt. The question I've been asking all the time is the cost on individuals and families, and I believe the society, our nation,
Mm.
is that worth it?
Yeah.
I don't think it is.
So I really recommend people read your books because you talk about strategic survival personalities, which I think is phenomenal, especially when you equate it to very well-known politicians, and it's just so obvious what they've taken on board.
I'm glad you got that. Yeah.
Yeah. And also the entitlement illusion. So this leads to an entitlement illusion where they are more deserving somehow than other people.
Well, if you've been through that kind of schooling, you have all this privilege, which you get used to,
Mm,
but at the same time, you suffer tremendous loss. So you lose your home, you lose your village. It's against the local
mm,
also. See, you lose your spontaneity, you lose your childishness. Yeah, you're
mm,
supposed to become a pseudo adult very, very fast. So there's tremendous, tremendous loss, and the sort of entitled attitudes which people come up with. When I'm lecturing after this, I sometimes show a little clip of Rees Mogg talking and being very sarcastic to people. I say, how
yeah.
does it feel that this guy might be in your consulting room one day? Can you be empathic to him? And he's presenting this entitled attitude. And I have to say, the only way as a therapist I can deal with this is to understand that that is a compensation for all this loss.
Mm,
Yeah. Otherwise, it just gets my back up like it does everybody else.
yeah.
Or it to the therapist, especially the beginner therapist, it makes them feel, oh, I'm not good enough. This man's more articulate than me.
Mm,
He's read more books than I have.
mm,
That sort of stuff. And then I said in Wounded Leaders, I said the entitlement illusion goes further because the rest of the country are in it. Even working class feminists, as I said before, want to vote for these guys because they think these are the people who will govern us. I mean, Farage is one as well,
I know.
And
Yeah. That
and
they think he's like them.
well, you see, the strategic survival personality puts on this kind of mask, and they can present themselves as anyone they want to. You
Mm,
watch interviews of David Cameron; he'd be one person to one interviewee, another person to he could be anybody he wanted to. Caring Dave, tough Dave, you know. It's that's the strategic survival personality, always putting on a mask, getting through, staying out of trouble,
yeah.
panicking when you think you're getting caught. That's why I started Wounded Leaders with David Cameron and the Calm Down Dear incident when,
Yeah, you go into that, and I really recommend that people buy
yeah,
that and read that. So then let's talk, because this is about systems, and I know Luke wants to come in and talk about lots of things because he's the systems guy. Let's talk about the impact that this has because they are leaders of the country. They are in very high profile positions, and the impact that it has had on our society and the law and the systems of our society. And I really like the anecdote you gave about the First World War. And the impact that this sort of entitlement illusion and game that I must win idea had on the First World War, and then it became about winning rather than human cost. You could probably say that a lot better than me, Nick.
yeah. I mean, if you talk about the First World War, I can't even think about it without feeling grief. And actually, what one of the things that happened in the First World War was that these boys came out of Eton and Harrow and were straight into leading, you know, platoons on the battlefield. So they suffered huge losses there, and you know, they kind of thought of it as, you know, play up and play the game.
Mm.
And that's how they've been brought up, you know, to be stiff upper lip, be a good loser. Um, but you know, when they were treating the shell shock soldiers, uh, and the there's a psychiatrist called Rivers who's described in Pat Barker's marvelous novels trilogy. Uh, he discovered that the main symptom that the enlisted men were bringing in shell shock was mutism. That means they couldn't speak.
Mm.
And I can imagine how they couldn't speak, because how could you speak about that? It's unspeakable what
Mm.
they've seen. So they were still sort of grounded in their body. So this was their defense. Of course, if he could cure them, they'd have to go back to the front anyway. Now, he said that the officers didn't do that. The officers didn't exhibit mutism because they had already, he said, this is in 1919, I think, lost the ability to experience emotions altogether. So fear as a, you know, they didn't feel the fear in the same way. They
Mm.
didn't feel the emotion of the battlefield the same, because they've been trained out of their emotions. Now, arguably, that's good for a warrior,
Mm.
arguably. But I tell you, it's not good for someone who has to go home to their family. It's not
Yeah.
good for a father. It's not good for a husband, and it's not good for a leader. Uh, so that whole Victorian culture, which the boarding schools kept alive and kept alive well into the 20th century, yeah, was a particular monolithic, hyper rational, hyper masculine culture, had no room for the feminine in life.
Hmm.
That's why they were designed, to get the boys out of the mother's
Yeah.
influence so that they could feel that they were, you know, a cut above the savages and the people they were supposed to be ruling. And so they could exploit the colonies without any conscience, which they did.
Mm.
But, you know, these are not qualities we need for modern life now.
No.
We, you know, all the problems are global. We need to be able to get on with people. We need to, you know, we need to be able to make compromises. We need to be able to understand the vulnerable. And so, yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a question now that I wanted to ask you, and then I'm going to hand over to Luke to do more of the systems thing. But you said about the blokeism, the chauvinism. Now, what always intrigues me is, why has the Tory party had four female leaders, one as a woman of colour,
Yeah.
three female prime ministers, and yet the Labour Party has had none? How does that fit? Do you know what I mean? With the chauvinism, with the female leaders of the party. Is it a matron thing?
Some say that about Margaret Thatcher, didn't they? They did
Yeah,
say that.
it's a mummy thing.
I
Yeah,
mean, maybe it's a bit of tokenism as well. I don't know. I think, you know, any I think that excellent Sarah Champion talked very well about coming into the House of Commons for the first time and feeling really this is a boys' club and you've got to learn to play it, or you've had it, you know. So why the Labour Party haven't had a female leader yet, I don't know. They nearly did. Barbara Castle was nearly there, and she'd have made a
they
good one.
did.
Um, and also nearly they nearly had Kinnock's wife Gwyneth, I think, was she Gwyneth Kinnock, was she called?
Yeah.
And she was very good too.
And
Uh,
Yvette nearly got there, didn't she?
yeah. So you know, I wouldn't go on that so much. I would think that the Tories think, you know, if we've got a woman up front, that looks good. Um, And but they've had some fairly hard women, haven't they?
Yeah, they've had to sort of adopt to the characteristics, haven't
But
they?
but I think that's a problem for women in general
Mm,
in the corporate world and the political world. They have to get out there, play the boys' game, show they're as tough or tougher, don't they?
mm,
Sometimes not easy.
no.
Yeah,
Luke.
Hi, Nick. I think listening to you is fascinating. So I have like several questions like
right.
popping in my mind. I think the first one is kind of really obvious, but why would you say empathy is so important? Is this
Empathy.
empathy exactly?
Oh yeah, empathy. Yes, of course it's important because everything in leadership depends on relationships. And you can't have decent relationships if you're not empathic. And I think what you end up doing with non-empathic styles, you end up doing everything excessively from, the left hemisphere, um, taking sort of Ian McGilchrist's work on board, so everything becomes about detail. And you miss out on the right hemisphere stuff, which is about context and relationship. And empathy is the key to getting into the relational world and having, what philosophers called the theory of mind, the realization that another person has their own thoughts and feelings and worlds. And actually, if you're going to get along together, you have to take that into account and work with that. So
Mm.
it's classic, and it's incredibly important when you're raising children because when you're raising young children, they can speak about what they want, but not about what they need. And as a parent, you have to intuit that. You have to do that empathically, and mothers do that from the beginning usually, and fathers sometimes have to learn it a bit, but it's absolutely essential.
Okay, so part of the secret source of life is empathy, is what
Yeah,
we're saying.
yeah,
Um, and I think also kind of what comes off the back of that for me, Nick, is around one of the points you're making that if we have these, I don't know, is it fair to say like callous, unemotional leaders, we lose the creativity and the innovation that then permeates through the workforce. And is that
yes.
one of the reasons why often in the UK we have these struggles with productivity and creativity? Because actually the way in which that leader's mindset or that elitist class of leader is very much about give me the detail, give me the functionality. And so we don't explore and create in ways we might like to or want to.
I think you're probably right because creativity in the mind um, is encouraged by a lot of right brain thinking and a lot of empathy and stuff like that, like we were talking about just now. Um, and focusing only on the details doesn't lead to that. But it's also the other thing that's really important when it comes into that sphere is, and I know you're interested in systems, the great system in Britain, with the unique system in Britain, is the maintenance of the class system in a way that you really don't feel in Europe. Yeah. And this isn't just the boarding schools. This started in 1066, when we were conquered by people speaking another language and who divided up the country amongst themselves. And that's the history of our aristocracy and our elites. And we still have this. It's still with us in a way, that doesn't happen in France because they had the revolution. Didn't happen Doesn't happen in Holland and Germany and Scandinavia because they had social democracy. And I remember talking to a man who worked in Massey Ferguson as a manager, and this was like in the 80s. He said he had to get out because they were still they still had these divided canteens. So they had the workers' canteen and the manager's canteen. And when they went over to a tractor factory to Klaus in Germany or something, there was nothing like this.
Mm.
And he said it was just so noticeable. And actually, in the end, he couldn't stand it any longer because he said it's not good. So I think all those things do add up to a kind of class resentment, you know, You know, when I was at Oxford in the holidays, we used to work in the Cowley plant, cleaning down the paint places, and we met people who had taken out who had built cars in their backyards from parts they'd stolen over the years, and there was a pride in that. So there's this kind of, us and them
Mm.
sort of mentality that has, I think it was the death of British industry in the 70s and 80s, that us and them mentality. It comes from the class system. The boarding school is the promoter of the class system. It keeps the whole thing going. So systemically, we're still much more divided. I mean, it used to be very clear we had the big newspapers and the small newspapers. I know they've all sort of got smaller now, but it's very noticeable in Britain. And you spend any time, in Scandinavia and Holland and come back to Britain, and it's like it's amazing. Yeah,
So I know we're going to move on to like future and solutions in a second. So I guess kind of from a systems perspective, going right back to one of the first things you said, Nick, that really intrigued me. So I've worked in the prison system
oh yeah,
and I find institutional violence
yeah,
a fascinating concept because it's harder to see. And
yeah,
I just in when you were talking about like, yep, hierarchy is there, just like you're saying in boarding schools. But I think there's also this thing of when people become institutionalized, both in my case, the staff and the
yeah,
guys or the young people I'm working with, it suddenly becomes invisible.
yeah.
And
Well, it's
I,
normalized, isn't it?
and in that normalization, how do you help people recognize that it is not normal? Like you can sometimes you can say like go like that's just really wrong, but
Yeah.
you get the institutional pushback straight away. So, in what way would you like to, connect the dots between the normalization of institutional violence
Yeah.
and ways in which we can empathize more?
That's such a good question, Luke, because um, the prisons and boarding population are about the same, funnily enough.
Okay.
Lots of people who've been to boarding school have said going to prison is a breeze afterwards, or being a hostage or something like that. Of course, one is expensive and entitled and got lots of privileges, and others is the opposite. But the institutionalization is the same. The hypermasculinity is the same. Yeah.
Mm.
And what I've had to because of the complexity of all this, I had to find sort of uh, simpler ways of talking about it. And one of the things that I say, and also because the highlight in the beginning on the boarding schools was all about abuse, sexual abuse and bullying and stuff. And I think we have to look much deeper, because that's sort of exciting and horrific and everything. But what you get in the boarding school is normalized neglect. And what I realized for myself was that normalized neglect is the context in which abuse inevitably occurs. You can have Ofsted, you can have whatever, you can have school counselors,
Mm.
but if you've got normalized neglect, you're still going to get this abuse. Just like you're saying in the prisons, you get this normalized neglect, you get the normalized violence that goes with it. And how do you come along and say this is not normal? Terribly good question. One of the ways that we do it in our therapeutic workshops, because we run very intense 4-day therapeutic workshops for ex-boarders who want to come and look about how to recover, is we make sure we almost always have a non-boarder on the team. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm.
So that the non-boarder can say, hang on a minute, you're talking about this as if it's normal.
Mm.
Actually, it isn't normal. You know, I went to a school where bullying was rough, he could say, or she could say, but
Mm.
actually we came home in our beds at night. Yeah.
Mm.
And so you got to get someone outside the system continually pointing out that the emperor's got no clothes.
Yeah.
And that's a very valuable role. And sometimes in the therapy, when we have quite lots of ex-boarders who want to train and do the work with our ex-boarders, and non-boarders come to the trainings because we run this training called the Unmaking of Them for weekend training. and making them the non-boarders feel maybe they don't know enough or they haven't had this experience. And I have to say to them, no, you're really, really, really important. We want someone to put their hands up and say the emperor's got no clothes on.
Mm.
Because otherwise we can all do it, they all do that normalization.
Mm.
So I'm interested to hear that how you see this applying to prisons as well, because that's fascinating to me. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what kind of sparks in me, Nick, was I remember working in a secondary school where the year seven said that there was bullying, but the year eight said no bullying, year nine, year 10, staff said there's no
Yeah.
bullying. And it struck me it's because year seven are new to the school. They haven't been normalized into that culture yet.
Very good.
And I
Yeah.
was like, they are the canary in the coal mine kind of thing in terms of the level of violence in this school. But
Yes.
give them the end of the year and they won't say there's bullying anymore because it will literally have been beaten out of them kind of thing.
Yes.
Mm.
And I know you sometimes you go to the head and you say there's bullying, and the head says, I don't tolerate bullying in my school.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
But it's just kind of,
Yeah, I think the challenge with the prison situation, Nick, is that it is such a palpable culture that once you're in it, it can be very hard to kind of go like, I need to decompress from what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, because I think the physical violence is often what catches people's attention, like you said, but the psychological violence is often missed,
yeah,
and that is the instigator of a lot of things that become physical, and the
yeah,
power games that are played with
yeah,
staff and with prisoners as well
yeah,
means that often the institutional violence is seen as suppressing, whereas actually it often amplifies
Mm.
the
yeah.
very
And
thing that it's trying to address.
yeah, and it's like the boarding school, it's 24/7. And unless you've experienced that sometimes, knowing what that 24/7 is like, because you give up hope of change, don't you?
Oh, that's a powerful thing to say, Nick. Yes.
Yeah.
It's because Luke, when I came to do that youth offenders day with you, and talking to some of the psychiatrists that work in, they were saying we have them for an hour a week, basically, but we can't do anything in depth with them because we cannot open their emotional vulnerability in an hour and then sort of seal it up again to go back into this environment
No, I mean I get it.
whereby they're in danger
No, you see that,
emotionally and physically.
and I have lots of school counselors come to me,
Mm,
and they're in a terrible, terrible double bind because they're appointed because of Ofsted and all those rules, which is good, yeah. But their fees are paid by the school, yeah. And they get children come to them and they say, look, the remedy for this problem is to stop boarding. The
mm,
one thing they cannot advise. And they've been through the normal sort of counseling training where counselors are trained to get people to open up and speak about their feelings. But there's really a question. Should they be opening up and speaking about their
mm,
feelings? Because actually, the children in boarding school have no choice but to survive. They really do. And some don't. Some don't survive. Every school I've ever heard about, there are kids that kill themselves,
mm.
either during school or just after. And I would imagine the same goes for prisons. Those guys have to survive. Well, same for the women in it. That survival is an imperative. And
Mm.
when you're in a 24/7 institution, especially one run on hyper masculine or militaristic lines, you feel it, you know it, and you got to survive.
So how do we move forward? What
Well,
do we, I mean, this is a question we ask people, do you change the people first or the system first?
uh, well, we've got to change the prison system, but that isn't my expertise. We can easily change things in the boarding system, very, very easily. And we can do it like this without anybody losing a job or any school having to close down, is that you stop the early boarding
Mm,
and you make boarding more democratic, so available through funding and things like uh, over 16s, sixth form college, sort of all those schools could be for over 16s. I don't think until you've been going through puberty in an institution is hell, I can tell you, and very confusing, especially for the girls,
mm,
really, because these schools the girls go to were designed on masculine lines too. And um, so by the time you're 16, you are perhaps about ready for a few forays out of the family. So if you could have over 16 boardings, more widely available, not so dependent on income. Like in Denmark, they've got something they call efterskoler, which means this sort of after school schooling. It's like a sixth form college, and people pay if they can afford it. Otherwise, the government part funds it. And that could work. Um, and so, because you've got to have some kind of workable alternative, I think you can't just try to close something down. You get so much resistance
Mm.
anyway. And it would prepare people for going away to university because a lot of kids who haven't been away find it pretty difficult going away first
Mm.
time at 19 or something. So that's one of the things I think you could do quite
Change the
easily
system, but
with the political will. But people will have to start taking on board the psychological understandings we've got about the boarding problem. And we've now, I mean, Routledge has published, I think, 9 books on it now.
mm,
It's all there.
mm, yeah. And then I also go abroad. I work abroad a lot in education, and a lot of them espouse themselves to be working along the lines of British boarding or the British curriculum.
I've got a terribly good reputation abroad.
Yeah,
And the boarding schools are very, very smart. They're opening franchises in
yeah,
Singapore, and you go to the smart schools now, they're all full of people from the Gulf, you know.
mm,
They'll adapt. You don't have to be, it's like that VAT thing. Everyone was so scared about VAT.
yeah,
But schools are going to go around that. They're not fools,
no,
you know. So yeah, you could do that. With psychological knowledge, you could certainly say children prepubescent children aren't suited for living out of the
no,
family. They're really not.
no. Luke, did you want to ask something else?
Yeah, well, I wanted to also pick Nick's brains on what do we do around leadership if we have this model of leaders? Um, is this like change MBAs? Like, how do we change the culture of leadership to move away from this model that is so historically ingrained within the system?
Well, um, I think that within the sort of coaching leadership development world, where leaders do their sort of top up work, the notion of cultures that are relational and that industries that work on a relational basis is pretty much it's common knowledge that's in now. People know that. Getting corporations to apply that, of course, is another story. Um, and the notion of that leaders should be emotionally intelligent, then I mean that's all in at that level. I think it's the bottom level that needs more work. We all saw the film Adolescence, and showed us terribly well how it's not working at the bottom. Um, I certainly think we should be very, very wary of um, uh, voting in uh, politicians who've had institutionalized backgrounds when we're trying to deal with our own kind of domestic policy. Um, I think the sort of the 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 reframing of a leader as someone who is not afraid to be vulnerable if
Mm,
necessary is absolutely crucial, i.e., a leader who can say, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. Not being, I mean, here you got different difficulties with the media because the media immediately say, U turn,
yeah.
you know. But I loved it. I don't know whether you noticed it, whether there was a moment in COVID when Angela Merkel, who was a person I really admired, uh, she was going to do a lockdown over Easter, and she was told that it wasn't going to work. People were going to hate it, and she came back on the TV and she said, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I think it's the wrong decision. We're not going to do it now."
Mm.
And I thought, yeah, this is a person I can trust,
Mm.
prepared to say you make a mistake because we all do, you know, not,
Humility and leadership.
yeah, not afraid, it doesn't mean to say you have to go down all the time, but you're not afraid to change your mind, to say you're sorry, to say I made a mistake. If Keir Starmer would only say that he got into a terrible mess when he was talking about women and gender, God, I'd be pleased. But we find it so difficult to do, and
Mm,
it's partly the media culture, isn't it? Which they're on their case all the time. But I think we could chip away at that, and
mm.
I think everybody in the end would respond to that kind of leadership.
And educate. A lot of us feel that in education, Michael Gove changing the system 15 years ago to resemble the independent school system, taking away vocational and critical thinking, was a very bad step backwards.
Whether back to the 3 R's, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more we can do. I want every child to learn 2 or 3 languages
Mm,
because it's good for the brain and it makes us better Europeans and blah blah blah.
yeah,
Yeah,
agreed.
yeah,
Nick, I could listen to you forever. I'm sure Luke and you could discuss forever, and I could just sit on the sidelines and chirp in now and then and sound like I'm at your level. But so thank you so much for everything you do. In a nutshell, what is the most important connection you would like listeners to take from this?
Well, I would like them to think that it is possible if we really properly deconstruct the systems that we've got to actually produce better systems, which are not going to be traumatic for children and are not going to actually cause us to look, uh, like we're living in the past century. And we've got to get to grips with the future,
Yeah,
and we've got to do it really fast, and we've got to do that communally with our neighbors. And I hate this sort of island mentality we're going into now as a reaction. It's the wrong thing. And I think that we can with very creative leaders we can deal with some of these problems that we've got. These
mm,
huge problems, but not in this reactive and reactionary way that we're doing at the moment. It's not going to happen.
no.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I do have just one interesting question to
Oh
ask you.
yeah.
It's sort of not related. We ask everybody. If you could travel back in history and
Yeah.
witness one event, but you
Yeah.
can't change it, what event would you like to have witnessed?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, at the moment, I'm reading a women historian called Zoe Oldenburg. I love women historians. I love the way they see history. And I'm reading about the First Crusade. And it's just the most extraordinary multicultural world that these crusaders arrived into. So I'd like to go back and see that. Of course, I'd like to change them. I'd like to
Yeah,
the crusaders not to be so arrogant and feudal and actually see what's there. But
mm,
yeah, I'd like to go back then.
thank you.
Right.
Um, we're going to put a link to all your books with this podcast, wherever it's being viewed or watched. What would you like to promote? Because I think you're brilliant. I think everybody should just read everything that you've done and watch everything you've done.
Got a
Talk to us.
fan.
What would you like to promote?
Well, I'm going back at the moment. I'm going back to my first love in the therapeutic work, which is therapeutic work with men and men's groups. And I'm doing a training next year for people who want to run men's groups, teach them about men and gender and about group dynamics. Because, if we have men getting together in groups talking about their emotions and things like that, the world would get a lot better, a lot faster. And at the moment, people are scared about this. They think it's sort of tree hugging nonsense. But it's really great. And men and the women love their men when they come back, or I'm sure their male partners, if they're gay, love them when they come back because they're more relational and more available. So I'd like to promote that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure for me. I've taken away so much from today. Luke, what is your biggest takeaway from today?
I think the conversation with Nick about institutional violence and how it creeps through society in multiple places. That I think is something that the normalization and how we change that is one of the things I'm definitely going to take away.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I think my takeaway is trying to get people to understand that most that then how can I say it's not like that they're not like them, but they don't think like you do. You think that they do and they get you, but that's a strategic survival personality
Oh,
mechanism, and you have to be aware of that.
yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. The millions of you that I've no doubt will be listening. Please subscribe if you liked it. If you didn't, like I say, listen again because you're wrong. It's fabulous. And do take care of yourself. Bye from me. Bye from Nick.
Yeah, bye.
Right.
Thank you for terrific questions. Yeah.
And bye from Luke.
Pleasure, Nick. Thank you.